This one financial concept is probably one of the most important you need to understand if you're looking to grow your e-commerce business. Without it, you can't get a true understanding of how much it'll cost to scale your business, how much you can afford to keep on investing, and at what level your business will plateau at. And despite the importance of this metric, most e-commerce brand owners don't understand it, even though it's not actually that complicated. The concept is that of the contribution margin, and in this video, I'm going to explain what it is, how to calculate it, and how to use it to make better decisions. So what is your contribution margin? Before we get into that, there's one concept we have to make sure we understand first, and that is the concept of variable versus fixed costs. Pretty much all the expenses that your business incurs can fall into the categories of being variable or fixed. Variable costs are those that change in tandem with changes in production volume or sales volume, whereas fixed costs are those that don't change with volume and which will stay the same regardless of the amount of activity. So for example, say you're manufacturing something, if you want to double your output, you may have to double the labor that goes into that production process. So the labor is a variable expense. However, you don't have to double the rent of the warehouse where the manufacturing is taking place. So the rent is a fixed expense. Or in an e-commerce situation, if you double your sales, you usually have to double your shipping expenses as well, because there's a lot more orders to ship out. So in that case, the shipping expense would be a variable cost. However, if you double your revenue, you don't have to double the cost of product photography. That's the same no matter what. So that would be a fixed cost. Now, in reality, most costs are neither perfectly fixed nor perfectly variable. For example, if you double your revenue, do you double your transaction fees? Pretty much. So that's pretty clearly variable. Do you double your ad spend? Well, sometimes you more than double your ad spend to increase your revenue, so that's also pretty variable. Do you double your UGC costs? Well, not necessarily. I mean, you probably would have to increase your UGC expenses to be able to afford to spend more on ads profitably, but it's not quite a doubling. Do you double your email marketing expense? Well, it depends. If you acquire twice as many new customers and your CRM doubles, then yeah, your software expense might go up. But if you're getting a lot of sales from existing customers, then not really. Do you double your payroll? Generally, no. I mean, maybe over time you'll have to increase the number of customer service people you have, but for the most part, it stays the same. Do you double your software costs? Well, some might increase a fair bit if you double your revenue, but a lot of them will stay the same. So in reality, most things fall somewhere on a spectrum of perfectly fixed to perfectly variable. So a little bit of judgment does go into this. However, for simplicity, we'll generally put things into the category of fixed or variable. The reason that's helpful is that once you know your fixed expenses, you know the minimum amount of cash you need to be able to generate to cover those fixed expenses so you're not in a loss position. And understanding your variable costs will let you know how much money are you actually generating when you double your revenue. So now that we understand the difference between fixed and variable expenses, we can go back to that question. What is your contribution margin? Well, your contribution margin is the amount left over from your revenue after deducting variable expenses that covers your fixed expenses. So understanding your contribution margin lets you know how much actual money you're generating when you double or triple your sales, and it also lets you know how much minimum contribution margin you need to generate to cover your fixed expenses. Now, like I said, the expenses don't always neatly fit into perfectly variable or perfectly fixed, but some major items to consider that are relevant for an e-commerce brand: you've got your ad spend, your payment processor fees, and shipping expenses, but can also include certain types of software expenses, some agency fees if it scales with ad spend or revenue, and even influencer costs, depending on how those are structured. Now, hopefully you're following so far, but maybe it'll be a little bit easier to understand this with an example to mail at home. Let's say you sell pogo sticks online, and in a given month you have $100,000 of revenue. Now from this 100K, we're going to deduct 5K for discounts. That leaves us with 95K, from which we'll deduct 20K for our cost of the pogo sticks. From the remaining 75K, which would be our gross profit, we'll deduct 10K for shipping and 2K for merchant account fees. And we'll assume that for us to be able to generate this 100K of revenue, we spend 30K on ads. So we'll deduct that 30K of ads from our remaining 63K to get to $33,000 of contribution margin. What this number roughly tells us is that if we were to double our revenue from 100K to 200K, we would also double our contribution margin from 33K to 66K, roughly. And there are two very important insights that we get from this number. Let's say our fixed expenses in this business are 30K a month. If our contribution margin is only 33K, that means we can only let our revenue go down a little bit before we're in a position where we're in a loss. It also tells us what the maximum amount we can spend is to acquire a customer. And this is one of the most useful and important numbers for an e-commerce brand to understand. So say, for example, that 100K of revenue cost us 30K of ads to acquire. That gave us 33K in contribution margin, and we have 30K of fixed expenses, giving us 3K left over. Now, if our business strategy is such that we don't ever want to be less than break even, that means that we can at most spend that extra 3K on ads, which means that we can't spend more than 33K on ads to acquire 100K of revenue. Or in other words, our break even ROAS is a 3x. Now, this can actually get a lot more interesting based on your business strategy. So say, for example, you need to have a certain amount of profit to be able to pay yourself, your numbers will change accordingly. Or say you've raised funds and you're growing aggressively and you can incur a bit of a loss, your numbers will change again. Not only that, but let's say you have a high LTV business. People come buy from you over and over. So you might decide the contribution margin from my recurring revenue will be enough to cover my fixed expenses. So when I'm acquiring new customers, I need to make sure that the new customer order is break even. So in other words, as long as my new customer contribution margin is a 0, I'm okay. The recurring customer contribution margin will make sure that I'm profitable overall. So as you can tell, the contribution margin is an incredibly important metric for you to understand the health and the ability to scale your e-commerce brand, but there's a lot more depth and nuance to it if you really want to go deep. In fact, I want to give you an example of just how dangerous it can be if a person doesn't understand this concept. So let's look at this example over here. This business is spending $250,000 on ads. They have a ROAS of 4x, which gives them $1 million of profit. Now, their cost of goods sold is roughly 30%, so that $1 million of revenue is going to come with $300,000 of inventory costs. That gives them a gross profit of 1 million minus 300K, $700,000. Now in this example, we're going to keep it very simple. The only variable expense to consider is your ad spend. So to calculate your contribution margin, we're going to take the 700K of gross profit, subtract $250,000 of ad spend, which gives us $450,000 of contribution margin. This business has fixed costs of $300,000, which means they have 450 minus 300, $150,000 of profit. Pretty good. But now let's say Big Daddy Zuck's having a rough time and performance on Meta goes down. Now this company is still spending the $250,000, but instead of getting a 4x ROAS, they're getting a 3x. That means that their revenue is going to go down to $750,000. At 30%, they're going to have COGS of $225,000, which gives them a gross profit of $525,000. The $525 less the $250 of ads gives them a contribution margin of $275,000. Unfortunately, that's lower than their fixed costs of $300K, which means they're now going to have a $25K net loss. So now think for a moment, what might you do in a situation like this? The natural reaction most business owners have is to reduce ad spend until they can get back to that target ROAS of 4x. So let's see what happens. The business owner panics and they reduce ad spend down to 150K so that they get back to a 4x ROAS. 150K at 4x gives them 600K of revenue, less the 30% in inventory cost gives them 420K of gross profit. From that, as usual, we subtract the 150K of ads to give us $270,000 of contribution margin. The fixed costs are still the same, so now they actually made their loss worse and have a 30K loss. And this is the really important concept that a lot of people don't understand. Just because you reduced ad spend to improve your ROAS doesn't necessarily mean that your business is doing better. You have to make sure that you're generating enough contribution margin to cover your fixed expenses. And in this case, increasing his ROAS by decreasing ad spend actually made him less profitable. So what might the business owner with balls of steel who understands contribution margin do? Well, they might actually turn spend up. So let's say instead of reducing their ad spend by 100K, they actually increase their ad spend by 100K. And just for the sake of the example, let's say the ROAS stays at 3. I know that's not totally realistic, but it made the numbers nice and round. So at 350K of ads at a 3x ROAS, you get back to about $1 million of revenue. From there, you subtract your inventory cost, which gives you 735K of gross profit. From that, you subtract the 350K of ad spend, which gives you 385K of contribution margin. That's now high enough to cover your fixed expenses, which brings you to an 85K profit. It's not quite as good as the baseline scenario, but it is much better than reducing your ad spend. And like I said, I know keeping a 3x ROAS at that stage, if you're increasing your ad spend, is not that realistic. I just want to make the numbers look nice, but you can go down to about a 2.6 or 2.7 ROAS and still be at a break even, which means even though your ROAS keeps going down, within a certain range, you can increase your ad spend and still be more profitable. This is why it's crucial to understand the mechanics of how the various numbers in your business play together. Most business owners keep it as simple as just understanding their revenue and their profit. If they're a little fancy, maybe they look at gross profit too. But understanding concepts like contribution margin can give you a real edge against the competition. Your contribution margin is one of the key financial figures that'll help you get from being a 5-figure brand to 6, 7, 8, and beyond. So make sure you're monitoring it closely. But that's it for this video. I hope you learned something, but until next time, take care.